of you know our guest today. We're really honored and grateful for Neil to give his time to us. Neil has been always very encouraging and very supportive of us, especially in our youth initiatives. And just as a formality, I'll introduce Neil Buhne. Is a resident coordinator for United Nations and also a representative of the General Secretary of the UN. Neil, prior to this, Neil was director in the Geneva office of UNDP and has also served as resident coordinator in multiple countries: Sri Lanka, Belarus, and Bulgaria.
And a little bit in Malaysia.
Yeah. And in Malaysia, and also served in different capacities in Sudan and Bhutan. And so it's one person who has a global perspective and also a national perspective, because interestingly, Neil served in Pakistan from 1990 to 1995 as assistant to resident representative. So I'll start with this. So given you have spent earlier in Pakistan, and so you have seen Pakistan across 2 different decades, so how do you see this change in Pakistan? What are some positive things that has happened over the years, and especially in terms of young people, because most of the population of this country was not born when you served last time, or they were just born. So, so how you see that youth pool changing Pakistan's socioeconomic landscape?
Yeah, I always feel very old when most of the population wasn't born, but it's probably true because 64% of the population in Pakistan is under the age of 30. And when I first came here, it was almost 30 years ago in 1990. What's different? Well, I think we just saw a little bit what's different through the interns who are working with you. One is that there's a lot more kids coming out of university. When I was here, university enrollment was fairly slim. Secondly, there were very few women coming out of university. And now if you go to university events, which I go to quite often in Pakistan, sometimes the number of women amongst the students, amongst the graduates, is more than the number of boys. And I think that reflects that there's also a lot more dialogue happening. You're called the National Dialogue Forum. So the fact that there is social media, there's more ways of interchanging, means that more young people, more young men, more young women have voice than they had before. I think there has been a transformation in terms of rural-urban as well, that with more and more people living in cities, I think this has broken down some of the social barriers. So, I mean, a friend of mine had said that at Karachi University in the early 90s, I mean, you may have had a number of women, but they generally were from the elite. Now you have women students who are from different social backgrounds. They may be dressed sometimes conservatively, but in fact, they're open, they're breaking down barriers that previously would have kept them in the house, in the village. And amongst young men, I mean, I think all sorts of new occupations. I mean, one of the interns here is a computer scientist. There's lots of energy amongst young people. It's actually one of the reasons I came back to Pakistan. My Pakistani friends said to me, hey, there's lots of energy, there's lots of new things happening in the country. It's exciting to be here. And they were right.
Great. And as a political economist, when I study Pakistan's political economy, I see deeper structural issues in Pakistan's political economy. And so I'll mention a few. For example, the unequal distribution of land and productive assets is one of the key issues. And so how do you see sustainable development goals addressing those deeper structural issues?
They address it much more than the earlier Millennium Development Goals did. I mean, first because the whole idea about the Sustainable Development Goals is leaving no one behind, and that was based on international experience that though poverty had declined, many of the Millennium Development Goals that related to social indicators in many countries had been met at sort of a macro level, but there were many people outside. So the Sustainable Development Goals were focused on reaching those people outside the mainstream. In addition, they had additional targets. I mean, one is your Sustainable Development Goal number 10, which focuses just on reducing inequalities, recognizing that inequalities are actually poison for the long-term development of any society. You have a whole range of goals that deal with creating wealth, jobs. That wasn't there before, and that also reflects the inequality. You have sustainable goal number 16, which deals with issues of governance, which deals with issues of peace, which deals with more explicitly with issues of human rights than some of the other goals. All of those deal with issues of people having unequal rights in the country, people having unequal access to resources, and recognizing that if you're actually to have a balanced development to a country, a sustainable development to a country, you have to have more equality than there is. The two countries that have progressed the most on the Human Development Index since the turn of the century are Sweden and Japan. And those are the two countries which have had consistently the best measures of equality of income during that period. So there is a correlation. Some people argue it. They say there's examples here of unequal development and people getting rich. But that is not sustainable. And the Sustainable Development Goals are about sustainable growth as well as, of course, sustainable management of the environment.
And so drawing on this, empirical studies have shown that in the long run, democracy tends to have better impact on sustainable development and development goals in general. And so in terms of Pakistan, we had oscillations between military governments and elected governments. But in the last decade or so, we have a consistent elections, and there was a historic first that and third time an elected government transferred power to another elected government. But there are also concerns about the quality of democracy, especially in terms of the freedoms that might be in Sweden and Japan, as you mentioned, are not that widely available in Pakistan. So do you see a concern that's another structural issue of democracy and freedom that hasn't been addressed, especially in the international development sector?
Yeah, I think it's Justice and Freedom is Amartya Sen's book. And of course, what you're talking about ties up very much with the fundamental concepts of human development that were developed by Mahbub al-Haq from Lahore and Amartya Sen from across the border. There is a link between levels of democracy and development. Amartya Sen showed very well in places where there is not voice, there tends to be famine, there tends to be these levels of inequality that harm development. I think in Pakistan, actually quoting Hafiz Pasha from studies that he's done, there has been a correlation where you've had this divergence over many years between sort of growth in income, growth in infrastructure, without that growth translating into improvements for everybody in terms of education, in terms of health. The fact that I think it is 50%, no, I think it's even more, 60% of the deaths of children under the age of 5 in Pakistan are from diarrheal diseases. Shows the inequities of that particular model, whereas Hafiz would also say that when there has been democratically elected governments, there has been more progress in terms of a range of social indicators. And even if you look at the current government's agenda, it's very much focused on issues of ending stunting, increasing access to education, improving healthcare. The ESAS program is partly a poverty program, it's partly a social safety net program. And I think it recognizes that economic growth in itself is nice, it may be a necessary condition for development, but it's not a sufficient condition. You have to have these other things as well.
And drawing on this, that Pakistan is a classic case of economic growth without development, in a sense that in terms of the overall income level, Pakistan does really poor in terms of the human development. So there's no correlation in terms of the average incomes, while the social development indicators are very poor. And part of it is that Pakistan has been suffering on those twin account deficits issues. So Pakistan has to go to IMF for many times in the past. And currently we are entering into another IMF program. So in terms of you representing United Nations, it's a much more democratic structure, whereas one country has one vote, whereas in terms of IMF, it is few rich countries have disproportionately higher share in terms of the policy mechanisms and the administrative control. So there's an argument across developing world and also in Pakistan that IMF policies or IMF driven programs increase hardship for average people. And how do you see that argument?
Yeah, I mean, that's a fairly classic argument and a fairly classic critique of the IMF. I mean, they are different institutions. I mean, the IMF is more or less has a board of shareholders, a bit like the World Bank, where the larger shareholders have more voice. Albeit the composition of the larger shareholders have changed, and China, for example, as the second largest economy in the world now, has a much larger voice than it did 10 years ago. But in terms of the program for Pakistan, I think the IMF did change, especially under the leadership of Christine Lagarde over the last years. And I think they have put more emphasis on social indicators. And even in the program that has been agreed on with the government, I mean, there are provisions, for example, that permit spending on social issues, that permit spending on the ESAS program. The way the targets are put for generating revenue, they're meant to be progressive, with more weight on rich people than on poor people. I think the difficulty, and as you're a political economist you would know this, is that even though the current government is putting a huge emphasis on actually getting people into the tax net who've been outside the tax net, in a country with as many challenges in governance as Pakistan, it's still quite hard to do that. And when a government is short of revenue, the easiest thing is to reduce subsidies across the board. And if you reduce subsidies across the board, it tends to have a larger impact on poor people.
Yes.
It's also easier to put sales tax and things that you can easily raise. And again, that disproportionately affects the poor. So although I think the IMF has recognized this in the program, it's going to be quite important that the government explicitly, hopefully with international support, can fight this natural tendency there is to move away from getting more progressive taxes, more from income taxes, and to instead focus on getting revenue or reducing expenditure, which tends to hurt the poor rather than the rich. But it's partly a function of the economic situation the country finds itself in.
And in order to revive economy, one of the sectors that have been identified is the tourism sector. And you have probably traveled more than, at least more than me, across Pakistan. Have you seen different regions in Pakistan? Do you see potential in tourism and how it can be translated into inclusive development? Because at time when you allow tourism or you try to expand tourism, it also leads to environmental crises, especially in remote regions. So how can Pakistan make tourism more inclusive for local communities?
Yeah, one of the more fun things I did was spend World Tourism Day, which is September 27th, for those who need to know, on Deosai Plateau last year. And we did it together with people from the national park. We did it together with university students who were activists who were engaged in the situation. We did it with local guides. We did it with some of the tour operators. And that's sort of the mix that you need to have for tourism to benefit local people. Because you need to have the government providing an infrastructure that ensures that, for example, that mass tourism, which is flooding Hunza, where I was very recently, that there's revenues or there's some limits put on that, whether it's from putting parking fees in place or some sort of park fee, but some disincentive from too many people coming in at the same time. At the same time, you need to have tour operators, so you can get actually tourists in who bring in higher levels of revenue. Not exactly like Bhutan where I live, because it's very limited there, but still the same idea. You get tourists to areas of the country that are that may be ecologically or culturally fragile, but you then get more revenue out of them. And then thirdly, you have to have voices amongst the community, which students can often provide, to put a bit of pressure to ensure that this tourism benefits the local people. I just was in Nagar Valley at a small community that was dealing with these difficulties, and it was very much a community-based project. They were trying to put in sort of prefabricated tents, various things in place to get as many local benefits as possible. But there's a lot of potential for tourism, and obviously it's the potential is greater in parts of the country which are perceived to be more secure. But in fact, there's places all over Pakistan that are very special to me. I've been in interior Sindh, I've been up north, I've been in South Punjab, I've been in what used to be called Fatah, parts of Baluchistan, parts of AJK. It's all quite special. Yeah.
So if you have to come back as a tourist, where would you go? Or pick few places, because I know you have friends all over Pakistan, so you don't want to offend anyone by not naming them, but yeah, feel free to.
Well, I think the northern areas are really quite special, because you have these amazing mountains that are more a concentration of more high mountains in one place than any other place in the world, and combining that with the way the people have modified the environment with beautiful irrigation channels, with walnut trees, mulberry trees, cherry trees, yaks or half yaks running around. It's all very, very special. But also, I mean, one of the favorite places I visited was Shah Abdul Latif Batai, which, for those who don't know, is a Sufi shrine in the sort of south central Sindh. And that was magical to be there with the thousands of people who come there to express their faith, to enjoy what is special about the shrine, and to actually enjoy the music and the dance that's there. There's so much that is unique here. It just has to be opened up. But you need to have facilities for that tourism to benefit people.
And in terms of the security situation in recent years has improved, and recently the UN has declared Pakistan a family station. And I remember our earlier conversations where you have been discussing this issue. Help us understand, like, what substantive measures that have changed now that UN has declared Pakistan as a family station.
Well, I think it's recognized that from the time when we evacuated families from Pakistan, which was I think in late 2008, early 2009, after the Marriott Hotel was attacked, and then soon after that when there was an attack on the World Food Programme office, that the security situation between now and today is completely different. I think it recognizes that most of the embassies, including the European Union delegation, has had families here for some time in Islamabad, and they found it safe. I think it recognizes that the authorities in Islamabad and in other parts of Pakistan have proved that it is possible to have a city that is safe from crime, but also has proved over more than 10 years to not have terrorist attacks. So for our purposes, if the risks are low, then we should have families here. We only don't have families for the UN in a place where the security risks are very high.
So again, at the global level, one of the major issues that we are facing as a humanity, as a community of countries, is the environmental degradation. And if we look at the data, the carbon emission or the carbon footprint of the countries of the global north or the advanced countries is much bigger, for obvious reason, than the countries of the global south. But now countries like Pakistan and many other countries, they want to industrialize. And that means that carbon footprint has to increase. And we've seen there are a lot of coal projects going on in Pakistan as well. So how you see that countries like Pakistan achieve development as well, but also with the minimum damage to environment? And what would be your message, especially to young people, about environment? Because eventually that's the most precondition of human life, to have a clean and sustainable environment.
Climate change is coming, the environmental change is coming, and you have to be ready for it, and you have to adapt to it. I mean, that is the unfortunate reality. I just was in New York for a bit. I like book shopping, so I bought a new book on sort of what the world will look like after climate change. And I couldn't sleep the other night, so I tried to open this book and tried to read it. Oh, couldn't sleep anymore because it was like a nightmare. How much the world is changing already with existing climate change scenarios, and the possibility of climate going up maybe 4 or 5 degrees, and the impact that would have. So for Pakistan, what does it mean? It means that Pakistan has to adapt to climate change. It's happening. It's going to affect Pakistan. Pakistan is a country dependent upon irrigation, dependent upon water coming down the Indus from the glaciers. Hopefully the glaciers don't all melt, but it makes it even more important that the irrigation efficiencies in the country are improved. It makes it more important that there's change of crops to crops that aren't as water intense, such as sugarcane, things that you can grow with less water. It makes it more important that cities are designed in a way like Mohenjo-daro was a long time ago, 3,500 years ago, where you have natural wind tunnels coming in. I remember going to Jerk, which is a place in Sindh on the Indus, and visiting the house where the Aga Khan, twice removed, had moved when he first came to Pakistan, and they had these big wind catchers on the roof. That sort of thing needs to be incorporated into architecture here, because Pakistan is going to get hotter, Pakistan will likely become drier, Pakistan will have more extremes of temperature, and Pakistan has to adapt to that. It still can. It's fortunate in having this Indus water system. It's fortunate in having a diverse climate. It's fortunate in having a very adaptable, it almost sounds patronizing, but resilient people. But there has to be that adaptation. In terms of the environment in Pakistan, well, Pakistan needs to clean up its cities for its own people's health, so people don't die from air pollution. It needs to clean up its cities so that polio doesn't spread. One reason polio has come back is because the wild polio virus lives in places like Dadap in Karachi. It lives in the slums of Lahore. It lives in Pindi because the sanitation is so low. So it's partly that. In terms of climate change, well, it makes more sense in the long run, and it will be more efficient in the long run to use more solar power. It makes sense to have efficient hydroelectric dams if you can manage to build them without too much environmental damage. I understand that why Pakistan wants to use coal. There's a shortage of it, but that has to be a short-term solution. I don't think Pakistan's not going to change the world's climate by what it's producing, but how it reacts to climate change can change the welfare of its people and the future of the country.
Okay, great. And so with this, I'll end. So I think one thing, especially from your talk is, and also from the global experiences, is now it is time to see economic growth and development as a means to a higher end. And that higher end is promoting freedom of all sorts and allowing people to expand their capabilities and be productive members of the society. So with this, I'd like to thank everyone, especially the audience, for giving us time, and also Neil for being always wonderful and always being very informative and learning. So
thanks, Tanisha, and good luck with the work of the National Dialogue Forum and your interns especially.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yeah.